Cyrus Cammett was both Brent's and Steve's third great-grand-uncle. He was the third son of Silas and Sarah Sally Seavey, both your fourth great-grandparents. These videos are the life stories of the descendants of Thomas Cammett of Salisbury, Massachusetts and Warwick, Rhode Island, and his wife Margaret Hollowell, presented in chronological order as they occurred. Cyrus was born on January 5, 1814 in Chester, Rockingham, New Hampshire. He married a 21-year-old woman named Laura Flanders. He was 22 at that time. Their marriage intentions was recorded in Salisbury, Mass under the surname Flanders, Loisa, and Cyrus Cammett of Amesbury, Mass. Intention on October 1, 1836 on page 355. In those days when a couple decided to get married, get engaged, they were required to publish their intention to marry. Some would marry on that date or shortly after their public intentions. Now we see another marriage record for Cyrus in Amesbury, Mass. in page 299, under his surname Cammett, Cyrus, of Salisbury, and Loisa Flanders, intention October 1, 1836. On December 3, 1837 in Salisbury, Massachusetts, Cyrus and Laura welcomed their firstborn son into this world. They named him Gustavus Cammett. Then, on April 1, 1840 in Salisbury, Massachusetts, Laura, once again gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Abba Cammett. In their 1840 census for Salisbury, Massachusetts, where we see the head of household, Cyrus Cammett, they listed one male and one female under 5 and one male and one female 20 through 29 for a total of 4 persons. Another daughter was born in Salisbury, Massachusetts on September 5, 1842. They named her Harriet Newell Cammett. Here we see the original records of her birth at Salisbury and the re-recording of her birth in a later record. In the family's 1850 United States Census we now see the family living in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Cyrus is now 46, married, and a joiner, with a real estate value at $2,000. His wife is listed as Mary instead of Laura, age 40, and their children, Gustavus age 13, Sarah age 10 and Harriet age 8 all attending school. In the family's 1855 Massachusetts census we see the family still living in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Cyrus and Laura are listed as being 40 years old, Gustavus as 17, Sarah as 15, and Harriet as 13. Cyrus is now listed as a house carpenter. Below Cyrus' family is his nephew, Stephen Gordon Cammett's family and his wife, Sarah Eunice Healy and their son Edwin Herbert Cammett. Stephen is the son of Cyrus's brother, Samuel Shackford Cammett, whose family was also covered in previous videos. Cyrus's 1865 Massachusetts State Census, he is 50 years old, born in New Hampshire, a carpenter. His wife Louisa is 50 and his daughter Sarah V is 24 years old. His son Gustavus, who is living next to them and listed below Cyrus, with his newly married wife, Adelaide Purington, who Gustavus married on November 10, 1864 in Amesbury, Massachusetts. More about them later and their connection to one of our nation's most celebrated poets of the 19th century. His name, John Greenleaf Whittier. Cyrus's 1870 United States Census, he is listed as 56 years old, carpenter, with a real estate valued at $10,000 and a personal estate valued also at $10,000. His wife Laura is 56, Sarah 31. His son, Gustavus's family is once again listed below Cyrus's family. I was amazed that Cyrus reported his real estate and personal estate values at $20,000, which is equivalent in today's buying power of just under $500,000. Cyrus' businesses as a grocer and dealer in doors, sashes, and blinds must have been very profitable. These businesses were listed in Cyrus's 1874 Amesbury, Massachusetts city directory along with some of his family members. Also Cyrus's properties were shown on a map of 1884 in Salisbury, Mass., and from his entries in the city directory, his properties were listed on Friend Street. We can clearly see 3 adjacent properties where 8 buildings were located at the southerly end of Friend Street owned by C. Cammett, and another property with a large building on the corner of Friend and Summer Street. These properties would indeed represent considerable wealth. On a cold Wednesday on November 17, 1871, their daughter Sarah Abba Cammett would pass away from typhoid fever at the age of 31. In Cyrus's 1880 United States Census for Amesbury, Massachusetts, he is listed as 65 years old, and a mover of buildings. His wife, Louisa, is 65 and keeping house, and once again his son, Gustavus's family is listed below his. On Monday, February 1, 1892, at the age of 78 years, 0 months, and 17 days, Cyrus Cammett would die of bronchopneumonia. Within his death records, his occupation was listed as a building mover born in Chester, New Hampshire, and his parents were Silas and Sarah, both born in Chester, New Hampshire. Friday, December 23, 1894, in Amesbury, Massachusetts, Laura Flanders Cammett, husband of Cyrus Cammett and the daughter of David and Sarah Flanders, at the age of 80, would lose her fight with cancer of the stomach, pancreas, and liver. Both Cyrus and Laura had a long and fruitful life together. Unfortunately, their final resting places are not known to us, but their memories will live forever within the generations of Cammetts. Cyrus Cammett, firstborn son he named Gustavus. He was born on December 3, 1837 in Salisbury, Mass. He met and married Adelaide Purington on November 10, 1864, in Amesbury, Mass. Adelaide Purington was born on February 5, 1842 in Amesbury, Massachusetts, the daughter of Daniel S. Purington and Sarah Jane Varney. Later in her life she would cross paths with one of this nation's most celebrated poets of the 19th century. His name, John Greenleaf Whittier, who was an American poet and abolitionist who, later in his life, was a household name in England and the United States. Gustavus and Adelaide had 2 daughters. Clara, who was known by her nickname, Carrie, was born on December 14, 1866, in Amesbury, and who married James Ellis on April 22, 1891. Later in life she would be a member of the Whittier Home Association, which was organized and funded by the executors of the last will of John Greenleaf Whittier. She would divorce her husband, James Ellis, sometime after 1920. They had 2 daughters, Florence and Adelaide Ellis. Their second daughter, Lizzie Florence Cammett, was born on November 24, 1869, in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Her birth records have not been found, but her birth date was calculated from her death records. She died on July 15, 1895 in Amesbury from tuberculosis at the age of 25 years, 7 months, and 21 days. Her parents were listed as Gustavus, born in Amesbury, Mass., and Adelaide Cammett, born in Sydney, Maine. In the family's 1870 census we see his family listed just below his father's family, all living in Amesbury. Gustavus is 32 years old and he is, more than likely, working with his father as a retail grocer. He listed his personal estate valued at $10,000, which is equal in today's buying power of $245,000. His wife, Adelaide, is 26, his daughters, Clara is 3 years old and Lizzie is 6 months old. In the family's 1880 census the family is still living in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Gustavus is now 43 years old, occupation, a grocer, living on 38 Friend Street in Amesbury. His wife Adelaide is now 37, Carrie is 13, and Lizzie is 10. The exact nature of John Whittier and Adelaide's relationship is unclear, but evidence suggests it was far from casual. This conclusion is supported by the following newspaper articles published in 1892 when Gustavus was 54 years old at that time. In the Merchant Journal newspaper on Saturday, September 10, 1892, on page 6. The reported the death of John Greenleaf Whittier, the American Quaker poet. Then in the Boston Globe newspaper article on September 20, 1892, the headlines read as follows: Whittier's will, How the poet disposed of his property. Relatives and literary friends remembered, and many public bequests. Salem, September 19. The will of John Greenleaf Whittier has the following bequests. He bequeathed $500 to $5,000 to families, friends, and institutions. And one of his bequests, and I quote, was to Addie P. Cammett, wife of Gustavus Cammett, of $5,000. Later he goes on to bequest the income from the copyright to his writings, with the exception of those given to Lucy Larcom, are placed in the hands of executors, who are appointed as trustees of the same, the income as stipulated in an agreement with the publishers, Houghton, Mifflin, and Company, dated August 12, 1883, to continue until 10 years from that date, is to be paid annually to Lizzie W. Pickard, Alice G. Berry, Charles F. Whittier, Lewis H. Caldwell, Phoebe J. Woodward, and Addie P. Cammett in the ratio of cash legacies to the above person named. The trustees are also authorized, if they think best, to sell the copyrights and divide the proceeds. 1/2 of the residue of the estate is given to Lizzie W. Pickard, Alice G. Berry, Charles F. Whittier, Lewis H. Caldwell, Phoebe J. Woodman, Addie P. Cammett, and Adelaide G. Caldwell. The remaining half to the residue is left to the Amesbury and Salisbury Home for Aged Women, the Anna Jakes Hospital of Newburyport, and the Normal and Agricultural Institute for Colored and Indian Children at Hampton, Virginia. The Cammett's $5,000 bequests in 1892 is equal in buying power today of $175,000. Plus the income from Whittier's copyrighted materials, explains the personal wealth that Gustavus and Adelaide had accumulated over the years. At this time, in the timeline of events, Gustavus' second daughter, Lizzie Florence Cammett, at the age of 25 years 7 months and 7 days, died from tuberculosis on July 15, 1895 in Amesbury, Massachusetts. In the family's 1900 census, Gustavus Cammett, a 62-year-old white male, resided in Amesbury, Essex, Massachusetts. The family has moved to 8 Hillside Avenue. He was the head of the household, married to Adelaide Cammett for 35 years. Gustavus worked as a grocery merchant and owned his home free of mortgage. He was born in December 1837 in Massachusetts, with his father hailing from New Hampshire and his mother from Massachusetts. Gustavus could read, write, and speak English. His household consisted of himself and his 58-year-old wife, Adelaide. Their new family house at 8 Hillside Avenue had a total of 10 rooms, 4 bedrooms, and 2 1/2 bathrooms, with a total of 3,250 square foot of living space. It was built in 1890, probably by Gustavus himself. In the family's 1910 census, Gustavus Cammett is now 72-year-old, a white male born in Massachusetts in 1837, resided in Amesbury, Essex, Massachusetts. He lived on 8 Hillside Avenue in a house he owned, free of mortgage. Gustavus was married to Adelaide P. Cammett, aged 68, and they had been married for 45 years. Gustavus worked as a merchant in the sash and blind industry, operating his own business. He was able to read and write in English. His father was born in New Hampshire, and his mother was born in Massachusetts. The household consisted of Gustavus and his wife Adelaide. In the Boston Globe obituary section, Gustavus' sister, Harriet Newell Cammett Clough, died on October 24, 1910 in Somerville, Massachusetts. According to her death certificate, she was the widow of John Clough and the daughter of Cyrus Cammett, not Hammett, as reported, who was born in Chester, New Hampshire, and Laura Flanders, who was born in Amesbury, Mass. Her cause of death was valvular disease of the heart. She was laid to rest with her husband in Mount Prospect Cemetery in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Her husband John Stockman Clough died a year earlier on December 5, 1909. His cause of death was Bright's disease. There was another error in Harriet's death record. Her birth date was reported as September 5, 1843 in Amesbury, but her birth recorded indicated her birth as September 5, 1842. An interesting fact about her birth record was she is listed below her first cousin Jonathan Plummer Cammett. Harriet's father, Cyrus, and Jonathan's father, Jonathan, were brothers, and they in turn were the sons of your first shared grandparents, Silas and Sarah Seavey. Gustavus Cammett, while being treated at Ames Jakes Hospital, would die on March 6, 1917. At this time he was living on Hillside Avenue in Amesbury, Massachusetts. He was 79 years old. His death records listed his parents as Cyrus, born in Chester, New Hampshire, and Louisa Flanders, born in Salisbury. He died of chronic interstitial nephritis. He was buried at Mount Prospect Cemetery in Amesbury, Mass. His wife Adelaide Purington Cammett, in her death certificate, died of a cerebral hemorrhage on February 22, 1922 in Amesbury, Massachusetts, the widow of Gustavus Cammett and the daughter of Daniel S. Purington, born in Sydney, Maine, and Sarah Varney, born in Somersworth, New Hampshire. The informant for her death certificate was her daughter Carrie Cammett Ellis. She was laid to rest in Mount Prospect Cemetery in Amesbury, Mass. In her death record it listed her birthplace as Sydney, Maine, which was actually the birthplace of her father. Her birthplace was in fact Amesbury, Massachusetts. Gustavus's daughter, Carrie Cammett Ellis, died on April 4, 1947 in Boston, Massachusetts. At that time, she was living in her parents' home at 8 Hillside Avenue in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Her obituary appeared in the Boston Globe on April 5, 1947. In her obituary, it was mentioned, she was a member of the Whittier Home Association, and she leaves her two daughters, Mrs. Leonard Brown, Amesbury, and Mrs. Florence Layton, Portland, Maine. Carrie's second daughter, Adelaide C. Ellis, named after her grandmother, who was born April 1897 and married Leonard Brown. The house on Hillside Avenue was passed down to them. She died at the age of 70 on October 13, 1967. Her obituary appeared in the Boston Globe on Saturday, October 14, 1967. In her obituary it mentioned she was a former member of the Whittier Home Association. She leaves a son, Leonard Brown, and her sister, Mrs. Florence LaForest Layton. Carrie's first daughter, Florence G. Ellis, born June 11, 1893, in Amesbury, married LaForest Howe Layton Sr. She died February 15, 1975, in Portland, Maine at the age of 81. In her obituary it was mentioned she was a member of the Whittier Home Association, and she leaves two sons, LaForest Howe Layton Jr. and George C. Layton, both Falmouth, Maine, and 5 grandchildren. 3 generations of Cammett women, Gustavus' wife, Adelaide, and her daughters, Carrie and her 2 granddaughters, daughters of Carrie, Adelaide Ellis, and Florence Layton, were all members of the esteemed Whittier Home Association. This marks the conclusion of yet another significant chapter in the history of a Cammett family. What follows is a virtual tour of the Whittier home.
Welcome to the home of John Greenleaf Whittier, where he lived from 1836, when he was 28, until his death in 1892. The house was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1962 and listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1966. This video is created and produced in 2020. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, it was impossible to open the home for visitors. Even though we have been shuttered, much has been done to ensure the integrity of the building with major renovations. However, what you will see and hear is equally valid for the subsequent years, and we hope you will both watch the video and visit us for real in the future. We are in the old kitchen, one of the 4 rooms in the house. Living in the 21st century, it's hard to imagine how important poets and poetry were to 19th century Americans. In Amesbury and across the continent, there are bridges, streets, towns, cities, schools, parks, and even a covered bridge and a mountain named for Whittier. The purpose of this tour is to give you a feeling for John Greenleaf Whittier, how he lived and was esteemed in the 56 years he called this his home. This video gives you an overview of the Whittier home, what can be seen, and show how important he was as a poet and an abolitionist. It covers most of the topics that arise on the normal physical visiting hours, and at each point provides some detail. It does not attempt to cover all of the artifacts and topics included in an actual tour. The move to Amesbury from the homestead farm in Haverhill, where Whittier was born, was precipitated by the death of his father and his uncle, and the marriage of his brother Matthew to a non-Quaker woman, which meant he had to move out of the family home, and that left Whittier as the only man to manage the farm. Whittier had never enjoyed farming, and by 1836 had found his voice and calling as a writer. 3 years earlier, he had become involved in the abolitionist cause, to which he had decided he would devote his life until slavery was ended. They sold the farm for $3,000, and with their shares, Whittier and his mother bought this house for $1,200. The choice of Amesbury is determined by 4 factors. Most importantly, it was the site of the Friends Meeting House, to which the Whittiers had been traveling weekly from Haverhill. It was an urban area, which meant they would not have to keep a horse and carriage. Amesbury had a reputation for being a liberal, tolerant, and classless society. And it was here that Whittier actually found a place for William Lloyd Garrison to give an anti-slavery speech in 1833, when Garrison could not find a place in Newburyport. Finally, Amesbury was beautiful, and Whittier was always very sensitive to natural beauty. There was hardly a spot from which he couldn't see a hill or a pond or a lake or a river. When Whittier moved to this house with his mother, his sister Elizabeth, and his Aunt Mercy, it looked like the picture on the mantel. The house was only 4 rooms, and so Whittier put a small addition for Aunt Mercy at the back, and Elizabeth slept in an unfinished attic under the eaves. This was less than ideal for a family, but even less than comfortable when they put up visiting Quakers and abolitionists. In 1847, Joseph Sturge, a British Quaker and abolitionist, visited Whittier, and he was absolutely appalled by the tight quarters. He gave Whittier $1,000 to enlarge his accommodation, and he more than doubled the addition for Aunt Mercy, who had died in 1846, to add a garden room and to put a second story on the east side of the house, and a comfortable bedroom for Elizabeth and a large guest room for visitors. These pictures show the house as it's in its various stages of completion, from the original 4 rooms in the picture on the mantelpiece to the extensions provided by Joseph Sturge's gift in 1847, and then further extensions after his success with the publication of Snowbound. You will find out more about Snowbound in the next room. To the final additions of the house after his death in 1892, when finally modern indoor plumbing was installed for the first time, inside water, bathrooms, and toilets. Finally, he had a summer kitchen added, and it was added originally perpendicular to the house on Picard Street. This has moved a couple of times, and it now sits in the backyard, and we use it to serve our teas in the summer, and we hope to resume those in 2021. We are standing in the original kitchen. Many of the artifacts on the hearth and the mantel were brought over from the homestead in Haverhill. The box on the floor was used to put coals in and put in the carriage to keep the feet warm. It was taken to the meeting house, as many churches and meeting houses did not have any kind of heat in them. The stove had coals put in the bottom, and the door was closed, and when women decided, or when they wanted to bake, They would put their forearm into the oven, and if it singed the hairs on their forearm, they'd know that it was hot enough to bake. The door was made from a very hard wood, and I'm sure it was replaced many times. Other artifacts are what they call a peel. Looks like a pizza paddle, and it was used for placing items in and out of the oven for baking. The flat iron down in the center was used, obviously, for ironing. And there's a saying, too many irons in the fire. And how that came about was that in larger homes, where they had maybe some servants, there were 3, maybe 4 flat irons heating up all at the same time. And when one would be brought back by one servant and taken away, the next servant would come and say, all right, there's too many irons in the fire. Which one is the hot one? On the mantle is a match safe. And on either side of the picture of Lincoln, there are 2 candlesticks. And they are called hog scraper candlesticks. I know that's a funny name, but it's the truth. When hogs were slaughtered, the candle would be lit, the bristles would be singed off the hog, and they would be scraped off the hog with the bottom of the candlestick for a much more hygienic slaughtering process. Whittier was a great admirer of Lincoln, and it's likely that this picture dates from Whittier's time, when this would have still been the dining room. When the Civil War began on April 12, 1861, it was a war to save the Union. It did not become a war to free the slaves until January 1, 1863. Lincoln told a war correspondent that Whittier's work, Luther's Hymn, had influenced him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. What Whittier did in that poem was to shift the focus of the war from saving the Union to freeing the slaves. This is an excerpt from this poem. Luther's Hymn. What breaks the oath of the men of the South? What whets the knife for the Union's life? Hark to the answer, slavery. O North and South, its victims both, can you not cry, let slavery die, and union find in freedom? We're now going over to what is called the snowbound room. This was originally 2 bedrooms. The snowbound room is what we call it now. And it was 2 rooms. The wall between them has been removed. The front half, where I'm standing, was Whittier's bedroom. He moved upstairs after Elizabeth died. The back half was his mother's bedroom, which would have been warmer because of the fireplace. On the right side of the door, entering this room, is a picture of the great elm on Boston Common, which came down in a storm in 1876. The mayor of Boston presented Whittier with a piece of the tree from which Whittier made this table below. The pictures of Whittier along the top, we think, were taken approximately 10 years apart. The pictures along the bottom are of the women in Whittier's life. The profile is of his Aunt Mercy. The photos are of his mother Abigail and his sister Mary and his sister Elizabeth. The picture frame underneath is a lineage chart of Whittier. It's too small to be able to see on the video, but we do have it available in our gift shop as a scroll. The homestead is where Whittier was born, where he lived for 28 years, and where he returned in his memory to write his greatest work, Snowbound, A Winter Idyll. It's also the scene of The Barefoot Boy, and a reproduction of the painting by Eastman Johnson hangs below the 2 pictures of the homestead in various seasons of the year. Whittier attended a school like the one in the painting, at the bottom for 3 months a year until he was 14. The school had one room with pupils of all ages and one teacher for all students. Joshua Coffin, Whittier's teacher, lent him a copy of Robert Burns' poetry when he was 14. Burns made a deep impression on Whittier because he was also a farm boy. This most likely set Whittier on his path as a poet. Whittier and Coffin remained friends for many years, and a friend gave Whittier a copy of Robert Burns' manuscript in the poet's own handwriting, which also hangs here. When Whittier was 18, his older sister Mary sent one of his poems to the Newburyport Free Press without his knowledge. William Lloyd Garrison was the editor of the Free Press at the time, and he published the poem, which was signed only W. Haverhill. After 3.5 months of receiving and publishing the poems, Garrison decided to find the poet. When he realized that Whittier was only a boy, Garrison urged Whittier's father to see that he got more education. And Whittier did attend 2 terms at the new Haverhill Academy. The first he paid for by making shoes with a farmhand in the off-season, and the other he paid for by teaching in a one-room school. He found the latter experience so unpleasant that he decided it was not worth continuing his education. However, Whittier taught himself very well through his reading and was able to perform the duties of the editing job that Garrison got him at the National Philanthropist. Whittier continued to earn a living and support his family as the editor of one paper after another until the success of Snowbound made him financially independent. Prior to the publication of Snowbound, Whittier never earned more than $500 a year. Snowbound earned him $10,000 the first year, which is roughly the equivalent of $150,000 today. This picture of the Champions of Freedom shows the importance of Whittier, most likely still in his 30s, as an abolitionist. Whittier is in the middle, surrounded by 4 leading anti-slavery senators. To my left is a picture of Senator Charles Sumner, a personal friend of Whittier's, and Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts who was beaten unconscious with a cane on the floor of the Senate by a Southern congressman because of anti-slavery speech that he gave in the Senate. The beating is often referred to as the first step in the Civil War. It took Sumner 4 years to recover. But when he returned, he gave a 5-hour speech entitled The Barbarism of Slavery, which was so complete there was never a need for another anti-slavery speech before the Senate or Congress. We're now going to focus the other end of what was in the 2 bedrooms. We are now in what was Whittier's mother's bedroom. Theodore Parker, over my right shoulder, was a Unitarian minister who led the movement to combat the stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which was enacted with the Compromise of 1850. And it required that law enforcement and citizens of all states, free states as well as slave states, assist in the recovery of fugitive slaves. Parker called the law a hateful statute of kidnappers, and he helped to organize open resistance to it in Boston. Parker coined 2 phrases which are associated with more famous persons who borrowed them. In an 1850 speech, Parker used the phrase, "a democracy of all the people, by all the people, for all the people," which later influenced the wording of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He predicted the inevitable success of the abolitionist cause this way: "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." A century later, Martin Luther King Jr. paraphrased these words in a prepared statement that he read in 1956 following the conclusion of the Montgomery bus boycott. He would later use a similar paraphrasing to great effect in two famous speeches and his final sermon. King's paraphrase included the words, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Wendell Phillips, over my left shoulder, was a Boston lawyer, and he witnessed the attempted lynching of Garrison and gave up practicing law to work for the abolitionist cause. After being converted to the abolitionists in 1836, Phillips joined the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he frequently made speeches at its meetings. So highly regarded were his oratorical abilities that he was known as abolition's golden trumpet. Like many of his fellow abolitionists who honored the free produce movement, Phillips took pains to avoid cane sugar and wore no clothing made of cotton, since both were produced by the labor of Southern slaves. In the corner to my left is a picture of Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania Hall was built for the abolitionists, and it was emblazoned with the motto, "Virtue, Liberty, and Independence." It stood for only 3 days before it was burned to the ground by anti-Negro rioters on the night of May 17, 1838. Whittier had arrived in Philadelphia earlier in March of 1838 to edit the Pennsylvania Freeman, and he was actually in the hall when it was attacked. Whittier escaped by donning a long black coat and black hat and ran from the front door with everyone else shouting, "Hang Whittier," thus disguising his identity. The photo below Pennsylvania Hall is of Lucretia Coffin Mott, and she was a Quaker minister opposed to the slave trade and active in the American Anti-Slavery Society. The frame of her picture and the walking stick hanging next to the two pictures were made from wood that was salvaged from Pennsylvania Hall. The desk in this room is the one on which Whittier wrote Snowbound. These are the first few lines of Snowbound.
Snowbound. The sun that brief December day rose cheerless over hills of gray, and, darkly circled, gave at noon a sadder light than waning moon. Slow tracings down the thickening sky, its mute and ominous prophecy, a portent seeming less than threat, it sank from sight before it set. A chill no coat, however stout, of homespun stuff could quite shut out a hard, dull bitterness of cold that checked amid vein the circling race of lifeblood in the sharpened face.
The spinning wheel and this chair belonged to Whittier's mother. It was used to spin flax into linen thread. The Whittiers grew flax on the farm, and they made their own cloth and clothes. This is where Whittier loved to spend his time. This room was added in 1847 with the $1,000 that Joseph Sturge gave to Whittier. It's the most authentic room in the house, with the original wallpaper and the carpet still in place. The furniture was purchased after the money from Snowbound started coming in 1866. The covers are original except for these red chairs, which were recovered in the 20th century. This room is the most Whittier. It was his favorite after it was built, and he had a desk from which he could see anyone coming by looking to his left to visit him before he could be seen. He could welcome the visitor for socializing, or he could escape if he didn't want to socialize by opening the door with his hat in his hand, which he kept on his desk at all times, by the way, and saying regretfully that he was just going out Then he could circle the block until the coast was clear and return to his work through the back door. He had a chaise lounge for a nap and his own stove so that he could keep the temperature as high as he wanted. Whittier was always cold. He was a very tall man. And he had a view of his fruit trees and the back garden. It was here that Whittier kept his favorite pictures. There was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in serialized form and sent it chapter by chapter to Whittier for editing and publication in the National Era. He was the corresponding editor of that paper at the time. The pictures of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thomas Starr King, one above the other, were two of Whittier's favorites. Emerson was a philosopher, an essayist, a poet, founder of the Transcendentalists and the Saturday Club, to which Whittier belonged. Emerson would sometimes read Whittier's poems for him when Whittier didn't want to read them himself. Whittier was very shy about reading in public. Another man who read for Whittier was Thomas Starr King. When Whittier met King in New Hampshire, when he vacationed there, King was a self-made man who had to drop out of school and support his family at 15, something that deeply impressed Whittier as he educated himself and become famous for his oratory at a church in Charlestown when he was asked to assume the Unitarian ministry in San Francisco. He organized the Pacific branch of the Sanitation Committee, which was the forerunner of the Red Cross during the Civil War. Lincoln credited him with preventing California from becoming a separate republic during the war. Over the desk is a small picture of Matthew Whittier. Matthew was the younger brother of John Greenleaf. He was married twice and had at least one other woman companion. He also wrote a satirical column for a newspaper, but it didn't do well. Through his friendship with Senator Charles Sumner, Whittier got Matthew a position at the Boston Custom House, which he held for 20 years. The other pictures are people who are important at the time. Garrison is on the right side of the chimney, and across from Garrison is Henry Houghton, Whittier's publisher and founder of the Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company. Now, let's look at the pictures on the other wall on the other side of the room. The most notable pictures here are of Joseph Sturge, to the left of a very fine picture of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was the most famous poet in the United States at the time. Now let's have a look at the room from the far corner before we move on to the parlor. This was the only living room from 1836 until 1847, when the garden room was built, and then this became the formal parlor for receiving guests. The dates of the furnishings in here is not known, except that Whittier's chair was a gift from George Peabody, a local philanthropist, and was built to Whittier's specifications. That would most likely have been in the 1860s, as Peabody died in 1869. The chair was his favorite, and it folded up so that he could take it with him when he went to visit his cousins in Danvers. The room contains portraits of the family. The largest on each wall are of his mother over the mantel, Abigail, his sister Elizabeth on the front wall, his brother Matthew to my left, and of Whittier himself. The parrot hanging over my head is a replica of Charlie. Charlie was Whittier's sister Mary's pet, which Whittier took in after she died in 1861. Charlie had a couple of bad habits, though some people found them amusing. He would sit on the roof and he would alternate shouting obscenities that he had heard aboard a ship where he was raised, and then he would shout, "Whoa!" at passing horses, often causing them to stop in their tracks and cause major traffic backups. The hole in the door over my head was put there for Charlie, suggesting that the parlor door was usually kept closed to conserve heat. On On the wall to the right of the window is a picture of the Jubilee Singers from Fisk College. This college for freed slaves was only 5 years old when it was facing serious financial difficulty. To avert bankruptcy and closure, Fisk's treasurer and music director, George L. White, gathered a 9-member student chorus to go on tour to earn money for the college. They earned $40,000 on the tour, and they saved the college. They introduced America to Negro spirituals and provided the first opportunity to see black people perform. Prior to the war, black roles were played by whites with their faces blackened. In 1879, when the Jubilee Singers came to Amesbury to give a concert, they visited Whittier to thank him for his efforts to end slavery. They sang some spirituals for him, and they left an autograph album to be picked up the next day. Whittier wrote his first draft of the Jubilee Singers in that album that night.
The Jubilee Singers. Voice of a people suffering long, the pathos of their mournful song, the sorrow of their night of wrong. Their cry like that which Israel gave, a prayer for one to guide and save, like Moses by the Red Sea's wave. The stern accord her timbrel lent to Miriam's note of triumph sent, or Egypt's sunken armament. The tramp that startled camp and town and shook the walls of slavery down, the spectral march of old John Brown. The storm that swept through battle days, the triumph over long delays, the bondsman giving God the praise. Voice of a ransomed race, sing on, till freedom's every right is won, and slavery's every wrong undone.
On the table near the door is the death mask. It was a custom at the time to make a mask of famous persons after death, of plaster or wax. The inclusion of the hand is unusual, and most likely is a tribute to Whittier's stature as a poet and a writer. Whittier died on September 7, 1892, while on a visit to his Hampton Falls cousins. His body was returned to Amesbury and laid out here in the parlor, in front of his mother's picture, with flowers that reached to the ceiling. 5,000 people walked by his coffin during his wake. At Whittier's funeral, 1,000 people were packed into the backyard. See the picture behind the death mask. The next day, 2,000 people are said to have visited his grave in the Quaker section of Union Cemetery here in Amesbury. Flags flew at half-staff and buildings were draped in black. It was a time of mourning for the nation. To finish, we're going to move to the modern part of the building, circa 1905, where we will review John Greenleaf Whittier, and you will get a chance to see our Whittier gift shop. This is both our gift shop and a meeting room for indoor functions and poetry readings. Sometimes we have poetry readings in the snowbound room. Whittier's earliest poetry was about legends and was written in a stilted poetic diction. Had he continued to write this way, he would have had very little attention, even in his own day. But when he started writing for the abolitionist cause, his language became vernacular, accessible, and passionate. It had the power to persuade and move his readers. After the war, he turned to the subject of his childhood, a time that was lost but revered in the minds of war-weary Americans. He wrote in a common language that Americans could identify with. Although his poems were popular, his earnings from the appearance in places such as Atlantic Monthly and the reissuing of his collections were not enough to make Whittier rich. But then in 1866, Whittier made $10,000 from the one poem, Snowbound, which was published as a short book initially. From that time on, Whittier, who had struggled financially all his life, was not only comfortably well off, but he was in demand for any occasion which called for a poem. For the most part, he could name his price. An interest in Whittier and his poetry lasted with no perceptible decline for a generation after his death. There were impressive observances in 1907 of the 100th anniversary of his birth, also along with the flood of articles by men of importance in the literary world. As the 20th century progressed, Whittier's vision seemed too innocent for generations who had lived through a depression and 2 world wars. But Snowbound will continue to live as an idealized portrait of 19th century New England farm life. His abolition poems remain as testimony to his contribution to ending slavery, and many of his poems are still found in Protestant hymnals today. We hope you have enjoyed this tour and hope it has whetted your appetite to visit us in person. The physical tour includes 2 upstairs bedrooms and a full corridor of pictures. You can find out more at the Whittier Home website at whittierhome.org. We also hope that it has piqued your interest in Whittier and that you seek out his poems and his works, and also to seek out other museums in the area, in particular the Whittier birthplace in Haverhill. Other local places of historic interest nearby are known as the Amesbury Treasures, and they can be found at amesburytreasures.org.